Cars of Carlisle Network, episode 63, featuring Sam and Lou, and the Intracast on Don Yenko's legacy.
Cars of Carlisle is your favorite internationally downloaded podcast about all things automotive. Darren and his CofC team are ever searching for interesting automotive happenings, real stories about real car people, and fun features to inform and entertain you. Each week, the Cars of Carlisle crew brings you show topics ranging from car shows to team adventures to auto racing weekends to behind-the-scenes human interest stories from car nuts that live across town, across the country, or even across the globe. Come join the road trip.
Hello, Cubers, and welcome back to your favorite informative automotive podcast. I am your trusted host, Darren, and in the right seat, literally today, in the Z06, is Scott.
Hello, everybody.
We, at this moment, are about 25 minutes north of New York City, somewhere in Connecticut. We are flying back from Maine, by car that is, flying along at low-level flight. But we are coming back to you. We're actually doing some of the recordings from the cockpit of the car itself. Reason being, we're making the 500-mile trip home to Carlisle as we speak. Then we're going to pretty much turn around, get to the Chrysler Nationals. You'll hear about some of that perhaps in the weeks to come. But most importantly, check out great photos that we'll be taking while at the show. So check out the Cars of Carlisle Instagram for awesome Mopar pics.
And I don't think you mentioned where we're coming back from, Rally North America, and the states that we've gone through are...
Yes, well, in the last, let me switch over here. Current odometer reading says we are at 1,539.5 miles, and in that time, to Scott's point, we left from Erie, Pennsylvania. We went through New Jersey, New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and then Maine. And we left Maine this morning at about 6 a.m. and been hauling tail the whole way down 95.
And what a great week. Not going to spoil anything because in weeks to come you can listen to everything that's happened.
Yes, in fact, to our fellow Rally North America drivers and navigators, you guys were awesome. We enjoyed spending the entire week with you. Really extended family. And from that, we spent time at Watkins Glen doing hot laps Monday night. We were at the New England Speedway, and we were doing quarter-mile drags just yesterday. Pretty happy with the car. We are running in the 13s as far as quarter-mile. But we'll get you some more details on that as we come into the coming weeks. But this week, we want to feature Sam Fahringer and Lou Gianacopoulos. They are two major friends of Cars of Carlisle. They've been supporters. You remember them back from a previous episode with the Muscle Car Millennials. And with that, we are going to feature them today. This is a little longer than normal because their show is extremely detailed and focused on the legacy of Don Yenko and all the Yenko vehicles. Listen in, love it, and be in tune, and we'll catch you on the backside of that. Today you're going to learn a lot about Yenko vehicles and the amazing cars that Don Yenko created. So why not have our trivia question be based on that? So, what does the SYC represent on the cars that Don Yenko enhanced? So for now, we're going to pass it to Sam and Lou and let them take it away for the Cars of Carlisle Network Intracast.
Thank you, Darren, for the introduction. I know we have listeners from all parts of the world that come from all different ages. Sam and I have a number of topics that we'd like to cover over the next few chapters of this edition of Cars of Carlisle. These topics will either have a tie to the central Pennsylvania area or a significant impact on the automotive industry that we know today. For some of you, you were fortunate enough to live through this first topic. We're going to cover Don Yenko. For younger guys like myself and Sam, we only have stories to learn from and really imagine what it was like to have supercars rolling off dealership lots that were enhanced, I think would be a good way to put it. So without further ado, we're basically going to cover how his legacy was born and the impact that is left on what we know as the automotive car industry today. So Sam, with that being said, let's really start with Yenko, the dealership, and how it was even birthed.
Yeah, of course. So the Yenko dealership is actually birthed by Frank Yenko, Don's father. He originally opened a Durant dealership in 1929, and then when Durant folded itself, he obviously shut that down in 32. So Don himself did not get into cars until he was about age 30. I believe that was in 57. Up to that point, when he was 16, he obtained his pilot's license. He went into the Air Force, and then he attended Penn State University and graduated with a business administration degree. It wasn't until age 30 in 1957 that Don Yenko actually got back into the dealership, and that is when Frank had opened his second dealership in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, which is the one that we all know about and where the Yenko supercar really originated.
So with that being said, Frank pretty much ran a typical Chevrolet dealership that family would go in and get their 1950 Deluxe or whatever it may be. Nothing too crazy, just a good way to put food on the table and take care of his family.
Yeah, it was just a run-of-the-mill dealership. It wasn't until Frank came in that it really became what it is today and what it's known as.
Right. So Don, fair to say, he was an adventurous guy, obtaining a pilot's license really not long after World War II. Where did the whole Yenko name that we know today originate?
So it started with Don actually being a racer himself. And there's a funny story that goes along with this about his first race. Can't recall where it was from, but he was on his way back from vacation and happened to be passing a race. And Don actually pulled in, kind of sweet-talked and or lied to the girl at the front and got his fake registration number and decided to race. And after that, he full-time became a racer. He raced a lot of Corvettes. Surprisingly enough, his most famous car, the Stinger Corvair, well, maybe not most famous, but the first car, he actually didn't race many of them. Interestingly enough, he built them. He was quoted to say that he didn't want to be competition for his cars, but he wanted to support them.
Don clearly had a need for speed. We know that. Let's talk about how the Yenko Stinger Corvair became about and why it even originated.
Well, you have to go back to his racing career for that. So at the time, he was racing primarily Corvettes, and Mustangs and Cobras at the time were a lighter car, and he just really couldn't keep up. There's a quote that's it's a famous quote, but it's a little misquoted. It says, "I got tired of looking at the rear bumper of Mark Donahue's Mustang."
So you're telling me that the only American fiberglass car was in fact too heavy to compete with its rival?
Correct, and that's why he picked the Corvair, actually. The Corvair was 500 pounds lighter than the Vet, and, interestingly enough, it was a rear-engine car. So great, well, not great, but for the time, great weight distribution.
Knowing that Darren's now a Corvette guy himself, I'm sure a lot of the listeners, especially with Carlisle's at Chevrolet coming up here, are not going to be happy to hear why the infamous Don Yenko is such a prolific figure in automotive history now.
Well, hey, he had a problem, and he was the guy to fix it. So he really went out and, it was his idea to almost use a loophole in Chevy's COPO system, which is essentially they would use to buy fleet cars, things like that, where they would option them differently than what the dealership, would originally offer. So there's a little known loophole that him and a few other guys would exploit to essentially get what it is they wanted into a car directly from the dealer.
Other popular names would be Baldwin Motion, Nicky Chevrolet. Okay, so before we get into the Yenko Stinger specifically, we want to really focus now on the 4 to 6 cars that wielded the Yenko name, and specifically with the Camaros. I think those are the most known. What was Don's racing career like? I know there's not a lot of clarity as far as the number of races, how successful he actually was. It wasn't a well-documented professional racing career in the sense that we would know someone from like a Richard Petty. Can you just explain a little bit about?
Yeah, so if you listen to Don Yenko, that he won over 85% of his races. He won 4 national titles and 7 divisional titles. Now, from what else I could find on this, there's a few websites out there that have his older racing records, but a general number I would go off is about 173 races, placed first 9 times, second 15 times, and third 12 times between 57 and 1986. So that's a relatively long racing career. Most of it predominantly was in the 50s and 60s. He kind of tailed out. I believe he only raced twice in the early to mid 80s, or at least only raced 2 of those years.
Sure. We're talking, just so the listeners know, specifically about road racing, SCCA governed racing, the Trans Am series, etc. We're not talking about drag racing or any type of other form. Correct?
Correct. Yeah, he was a road racer through and through. Now, some of his cars coming off the lot would run 13-second quarter miles, but that's not really why he was doing this. He was doing this to compete in road racing. He competed in Le Mans, 24-hour races. He was a road racer through and through.
Sure. I mean, the 69 Yenkos, I think the best clock by one of the magazines at the time was just under 12 seconds.
Yeah, I have the exact numbers. We'll get to that later. I believe it was 11.91.
So let's focus then on the Yenko Stinger, really the first one that rolled off his dealership lots.
Yeah, so like I said, he ordered the Corvair over the Corvette, mainly because the weight differential from the factory is 500 pounds under. To compete in the SCCA as a production D car, though, he needed to produce at least 200 of these Yenko Stingers. So in the first year, 66, he ordered 100 ermine white, 4-speed, 140 horsepower Corsas. It's a rear-mounted, horizontally opposed 6-cylinder unibody car. Started out, he removed the rear seat, removed all the Corsair badging. He didn't want to be associated with that, and Yenko knew he was a true marketing guy. He wanted his name on everything, so this is kind of where that started. So he fitted it with a custom Yenko fiberglass deck lid with an engine cover and a built-in spoiler. Threw on some stiffer rear springs and some Monroe double-action shocks, a Cadillac dual-master cylinder, and started painting it with 3 blue stripes as a narrow line on each side of a fat band that ran from the grill-less front over the hood, roof, and rear. He had fiberglass panels that he put over portions of the windows, and there's a 1966 Sports Car Magazine article that Don Yenko wrote that he said he essentially used pizza boxes to mock all that up, which I always thought was pretty cool.
Sure, Ralph Nader would love to hear that after deeming the car unsafe at any speed.
That's true. So he offered these first Yenko Stingers, as they were called, in 4 stages of tune. There's a base level, stage 2, a stage 3, and a stage 4. Essentially, the base level was just 20 horsepower over the factory, 140 horsepower. They tuned the Rochester carbs, put in some connecting rods and bearings, had a larger oil pan, a few different things like that. All the way up to the Stage 4 car, which ended up being a 240 horsepower car. I believe they were 10.5 to 1, compression ratio with ported and polished heads, forged pistons, high performance distributor, light flywheel, Stewart Warner gauges installed, and a performance cam. He also did this again. He ordered another 100 the following year in 67. And I find...
Before we get into 67, how much were the options, the 2, 3, and 4? The Corsa was the Corsa Corvair to begin with was a relatively cheap car, starting about $2,600. It was really a good bang for your buck, having a sporty-like feel. But if I wanted to get serious and really, say, go right to the Stage 3, how much am I actually spending?
The Stage 3 was going to cost you $900 off the lot more than what the base price. Yeah, and
so you're spending a significant amount of money to get the hottest Corvair you can find in the country.
Yeah, and at the time, I mean, this is a light rear-engine car. It really was
unsafe at any speed.
It was, well, and maybe not now, but it really was an interesting car to kind of start off this muscle car era of Don Yenko. You think of the Camaro, you think of the Yenko Deuce, the Chevelle, the Vega. Well, maybe not the Vega, but you think of these cars as true pony and muscle cars, and it's just kind of funny to have a rear-engine little Corsa is the thing that kicked all this off.
Sure, and then you get to the big dog gears. You want to jump right into the Camaro?
One more funny point about the Stinger. So the last Stinger that Don Yenko built was built in 1969, and it was built for Goodyear. So Goodyear had, their livery on it. Essentially, they had all their, markings on it and all that fun stuff. And they actually built it to test, of all things, tires specifically designed for Fords. Because at the time, there wasn't a Ford that could do the high-temperature tests and sustain it for long enough. So they had a Don Yenko built Chevy Corvair running tire tests for their Fords.
Why'd they have to pick Corvair?
It was the only car that could sustain that speed for that long.
Right, and what was the standard wheel size? Wasn't it like 14 inches?
Standard on the Corvair, I believe, was 14 inches, but the wheel size that they tested was for 13-inch cars.
Because
13-inch rims.
Goodyear specifically needed.
Specifically for Ford. So, you're welcome, Ford.
That's the the Detroit sharing of minds and engineers. Cool. So now we're into 67. I think the most well-known cars have to be the 67 through 9 Camaros that Yenko was able to get his hands on and do some really cool stuff with.
Yeah, so one of the things that Yenko wanted to do was get around an internally imposed edict by Chevy of 400 cubic inches only in their engine bay. Ford and Mopar at the time didn't have the same restrictions, so they were kind of getting left in the dust a little bit. So what he did to get around that was he would order Camaros, essentially 396 Camaro cars, and order an engine from Chevy, a 427, and through a bunch of clever modification, he would put that in. And the way he started was actually, the first two cars were the Camaro Stormer. And that name obviously didn't stick. That's not what we think of, but those were the first two. And there's actually debatably a third one, which was Yenko's private car. These cars were based off the Z28 package and heavily influenced by a company called RST, which was a side business of 3 GM engineers who had actually helped develop the Z28 package. So what Yenko did was he ordered the Camaro racing suspension parts, engineered and produced by RST. He also procured some headers, poured and polished cylinder heads, Z28 cam, rear springs, aluminum wheels, 37-gallon fuel tank, and a lightweight fuel pump. He also sourced some other parts from American Racing for the wheels. I believe they were torque thrusts. Some additional headers, tailpipes, traction bars, camshaft, things like that from a man named Bill Thomas, and some Kone shocks. End result was a 12.5 to 1 compression ratioed engine with forged pistons, heavy-duty valve springs and retainers, and a Holley 800 CFM carb on a tuned runner intake manifold. You know, as we were talking earlier, he was a guy who was focused not just on pure speed, but also on road racing. That's really where he, made his money there. So, he front and rear springs put in, all new steering components, hardened axles, put a posi diff in it, quick ratio steering.
Robbed brakes from his counterpart at Corvette.
Yeah, he robbed a bunch of parts from a bin for old Corvette stuff. He also installed a roll bar in the interior, competition belts, harnesses, and a bunch of Stewart Warner gauges in the car. So there was actually two of these cars were built, and they were built for friends of Don. One was red and one was blue, and then there are rumors that he had his own car that he had kind of tested some of these theories on. But yeah, there were only two of those, and as of right now, I could not find any record that they were still in existence or documented anywhere. I don't know if they are in a collection somewhere. I'd love to find that out.
How does the 37-gallon fuel tank, does it just take up the trunk, or?
Well, you got to think, he was a long-distance road racer.
Right.
He's used to racing Le Mans. That's what he's building with. That's the intention he has in the back of his head. So, yeah, he's going for long-term racing. So,
and the craziest
Need
thing
the fuel.
is $3 a gallon for 87. You obviously would have to run premium, if not race gas on these. So, not a cheap car to maintain. And
now, at the day, gas was probably 3 cents a gallon, but
well,
yeah.
We didn't exist back then. I think it was a little bit more. Cool. So, if you don't know this, that's totally fine. But the Z28 package, was that an option on factory 67 Camaros?
Yes, it was.
So you had RSSS, Z28. What were the 67s then that Yenko actually produced in the first year? Because the Stormer was almost like a prototype for him.
Correct. Yeah. So the first ones he produced 54 and 67. Like I said, they were a 396 that he had bought a 427 engine for. And at his company, or at his dealership, he had swapped those in. Had a 410 rear in him, heavy-duty suspension. He had a fiberglass Stinger hood that was real similar to the 67 big block Corvettes that was installed on those. In later years, that changed to a cowl induction hood. Those cars came with an M21 transmission. Here we see a point where he's essentially, kind of doctoring these cars at home. But as they move on in model years, he actually used this COPO loophole that I spoke about earlier, and eventually actually came up with his own COPO numbers. They were specifically for him to have Chevy do it at the dealership, which kind of went in the face of their internal edict to not have anything over 400 cubic inches inside of a Camaro.
Sure. Copo obviously stood for Central Office Production Order. Certainly wasn't the only dealership to be utilizing this, but really, to your point, had such a strong idea to market and brand himself in the Yenko name that they've really become the most popular, in my opinion, and certainly the auction results that we've seen over the past 10, 15 years from Mecum, Barrett-Jackson, RM Sotheby's, etc. The cars have a significant value, which we'll get to in a little bit. 68, first year that he was actually able to use Copo to his advantage and cut a little bit of work out of his parts department.
Almost. So Copo actually in 68 was still buying the engines from Chevy and swapping them themselves. Interestingly enough, so he would get the 427 short block. He would take the 396 out of the car. He would reuse the 396 heads, carb, intake, headers, pretty much most of the internals of the engine he would reuse on the 427 block. And another thing you'll notice about Yenko was he wasn't afraid to use other GM parts in his cars. I think earlier, in the Corvair, we mentioned he was using Corvette brakes and he was using a Cadillac dual master cylinder. He really liked to use what he had available to make the car better.
So when you look at 67 and 68, he wasn't producing these like the Yenko Stinger that needed a specific production order amount to meet racing standards. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, actually in 68, he only produced 64. So, at this time, we're just over 100 Yenko Camaros in the first two production years.
Sure, with 54 being 67. Do we know how many of these cars exist? There has to be a few floating around.
That still exist?
Yeah.
That's a tough number to get down. There is a Yenko.net registry that you can check out. Has a lot of really good information, a lot of really cool cars. But they're really, as far as we know, only about half exist today. Now, that's not to say there's not a bunch. You still hear on Motor Trend or whatever, you still hear of a car getting found in a barn that nobody knew it's got 1,000 factory miles into Yenko Deuce or something. And, they happen, but yeah, as far as we know, I would say about 30 or so exist today.
69 was a huge year, and we'll get into that. But
yeah, another cool fact about the 68. So Yenko, I believe in that year, had made a fiberglass spoiler to put on the rear, and that was before Chevy even made a fiberglass spoiler. So actually in 69 they adopted that, and he didn't have to put his own spoiler on there. But he used the Pontiac 14x6 steel wheels and had his own special Yenko caps on them, Yenko emblems on the front fenders, the tail panel, put the 427 emblems on as well to differentiate it a little bit, and then had Stuart Warner pedestal mounted tack and gauges, which is a kind of like at least in my mind, that's a very telltale Yenko thing, is the exterior mounted tack. It's one of those things I always loved seeing when I was younger.
Chevy purists love to hear that Pontiac wheels were the choice.
Pontiac wheels? Yeah. Hey, he used whatever was available, and it's kind of the luxury of owning your own dealership. You can kind of play with all the parts bins.
For sure. So 69, not just the Yenko Camaro. Certainly, I think that's the most known model year, but he really expanded product lines and got into the intermediate and subcompact market as well.
This is a year that's kind of tough to nail down on the production amount. I've seen numbers that essentially range from about 198 to 201. It's really tough to nail that down, but it's somewhere in that 200 range. This was the first year, though, that working with Copo and Chevy, he actually had the 427s installed at the factory, which is incredible because what that means is when he sold a Yenko Chevy Camaro off the lot, he could sell that absolute monster of a car with a 5-year, 50,000-mile warranty. This is a car that actually this is the car that at the time had the fastest quarter mile speed at 1194 at 114 miles an hour, and it came with a 50,000-mile warranty. So that always blows my mind.
You just don't hear of that. I think we kind of relish today that you could buy a Hellcat or a Demon or a ZR1 Corvette, and they do have bumper-to-bumper warranties that are just insane. But back then, that almost didn't exist.
It was unheard of at the time, yeah.
So to get 5 years and 50,000 on a car that was probably going to be used either in a street trim or on an SCCA course or on a drag strip, pretty remarkable. So with that being said, I mean, 69 Camaro, probably the most well-known Yenko.
Yeah, I would say. With the Camaros especially, it was the most highly produced. He produced, I would say close to equal numbers in the Yenko Novas, and I think the Vegas are close to the numbers. But realistically, no one really cares about the Nova or the Vega in comparison. I mean, the 69 Yenko Camaro is the one that people think of when they think of Yenko.
For sure. But he did produce a Nova trim in 69 and 70 as well as a Chevelle. Can we just talk a little bit about them and production numbers, what was different from the Camaro, etc.?
Yeah, so the Nova, which holds a near and dear place in my heart, I'm a proud Nova owner, so I absolutely love Yenko, and I love the Yenko Deuce. One of my dream cars.
Sitting behind it right now.
Yeah. In 69, 37 Novas were ordered by Yenko. 28 got the 427 engine, and the other 8 actually retained the 396 from the factory. So I believe there was a recent article that came out within the last year or so of somebody finding an unmolested Yenko 396 car in a barn. It's a pretty cool read. It's pretty rare because only 8 had that. So from what I can tell, only about 7 to 8 actually still remain and are actually registered and known. So that somebody found one is pretty incredible. This is in 69 with the Camaro, with the Nova. That's where you get the very famous side stripe that comes down the Yenko, and it says Yenko SC or SYC. I'm sorry, Yenko Supercars. It also has the SYC emblazoned on the headrest of the car. Like I said, he was a marketer. He wanted his name on every piece of it. So he had, all the Yenko Supercar graphics on the car. He also outfitted the 69 Nova and the Camaro with the 140 mile per hour Speedo and a Stewart Warner 8,000 RPM tack, which for those cars was relatively unheard of. Ordered the cars with the SS driveline, had a Muncie M21 4-speed, a 12-bolt rear, heavy-duty springs, and an 1 1/8 sway bar in the front, and limited the colors on these Novas to garnet red, fathom green, Le Mans blue, and rally green.
Not primer gray?
No.
Okay, just checking.
So he also added the F41 coil and leaf springs. The F41, I believe, was the Z28 package offered on the Camaro, and obviously the Nova. They share the same subframe and all that. So
sure.
Yeah, that was their package, the F41. So this car, I believe Don, he actually said that this car was lethal and that he shouldn't have produced it. It did 0 to 60 in 5.1 seconds and at a top speed of 120 miles per hour. It was just an absolute beast of a car because it was lighter than the Camaro and it had way too much horsepower.
Not too much changed in 70, and we'll get to the Chevelle. Certainly want to talk about that one, but the Yenko Deuce is actually the only one I knew. I didn't know he produced a Yenko Nova in 69 before we kind of prepped for this. That car was pretty iconic in its own way, although slightly different. So maybe you just want to spend a few minutes there. Yeah,
the Yenko Deuce, that was, in my memory, that's one of the first cars that I remember just falling absolutely in love with. I love those cars, always will. 1970 was kind of a bad year for the Deuce, only in that it lost the 396 and the 427. And that was due to an EPA emission standard where Yenko would have to, I believe, submit to a 50,000-mile road test for it that he just wouldn't be able to do and produce the car that year. Sure. It was one of those things that, as the 70s progressed, obviously the emission standards got worse and worse and worse. But at that time, he just couldn't perform the tests, and there was no way he would be able to get these cars done if that's what he had to do. So in their place, he used the high-output 350 V8, the Mighty Mouse, the Chevy small block, and that was out of the Camaros. I believe they also came in Chevelles at the time. Corvettes as an LT1 engine. Based that off the SS driveline with a 12-bolt rear, 4-speed, the heavy-duty springs, the 1 1/8 sway bar, and he also put his own custom 14-inch SS Yenko rims on the car. And in that year, he produced about 175. Again, we don't know the exact numbers on how many remain, but if you check out the Yenko.net registry, you'll be able to find all the ones that still exist that we know of today.
Cool. And then the Chevelle, obviously going back to 69. Pretty special car in its own right. I think a little bit different in the sense that this was an intermediate body for GM. What was special about these cars?
So the Chevelles, he ordered 99 of them, and they were the 350 Chevelles. And, of course, as per Yenko, they got the 427 V8 treatment. They had a cast iron block, cast heads. It ran at 11.1 compression. Solid lifter cam, had about an 800 CFM Holley carburetor on them, and an aluminum intake manifold. But these cars kind of stick out in that they're, a larger car. They're a little bit of a departure from what Yenko did. And it's interesting that he chose such a large car, being that he was a road racer. And I believe that's why this was a one-year-only vehicle,
Sure.
is because they didn't quite fit what he truly was after.
So were there two engine options, a 350 cylinder and the 427 that we know?
As far as I know, they actually were all 427 cars, but he ordered them as 350 cars.
Really?
Which is odd because at the time, I don't believe Chevy had the same restriction that they did on the Camaros. But it was a sedan class restriction, so they might have still had the restriction on the 400 cubic inches, but it's odd that he wouldn't have ordered them with the 396 like every other one.
Sure. GM did have the restriction for anything over 400 cubic inches to be in their intermediate, their A-body platform. That was lifted in 70, and that's how we got graced with the LS6 Chevelle and the GS455 and the Oldsmobile and Pontiac series as well. So they did lift that in 1970, but he had to get around it, and obviously did. Again, imagine this flying today, especially with insurance and social media. Don't know how Dodge produced the Demon, but here we are.
Now, while this was a bigger car, though, I do want to say that this by no means was this a slow car. So it still ran a 13.3 second quarter mile at 108 miles an hour, bolstered especially by the 410 gears in the 12-volt axle. So it was definitely still a quick car. It sported the Yenko livery. It was a true Yenko car. It just wasn't the quick, light SCCA road racing course that we might think of when we think of the Camaro or the Nova.
Sure, and like the Nova only came in a select number of colors. Couldn't get it in the earth tone green or the earth tone tan. It came in some pretty exciting things.
The Chevelle, though, you could get in a whole bunch of colors. You could get it in Le Mans blue, Fathom green, butternut yellow, Hugger orange, garnet red, Daytona yellow, Dover white, and Olympic gold. And if you've ever seen a Daytona yellow Yenko car, or even Yenko clone, Yenko tribute car, it's a really awesome color because Chevy wasn't as well known as, let's say, Dodge was with experimenting with colors.
Sure.
But the Daytona yellow cars are a real sharp car.
So 1970, here we are, we're back to the Yenko Deuce, and it's his farewell tour. This is the last car he's producing, right?
No, and oddly enough, he chose his next car to be the Chevy Vega. And the Chevy Vega was just a car that was doomed from the start. It wasn't a great car, but he wanted to compete with the European market, the smaller, lighter, four-cylinder cars, and he chose the Vega. Originally, he wanted to he had to run at a minimum of 500 cars. So in his first year, in 1971, he ordered 200 cars and had the idea of using the COPO system to have a special turbo installed on the car at the factory. And Chevy didn't go for that. So he actually ditched the idea completely of the turbo, but would sell it through his parts catalog. But you would have to install it yourself.
This is the first I've ever heard, being a turbo fan myself, and especially what they do today. This is the first I really heard of turbos being even thought of on production cars in the early 70s.
Yeah, so he really wanted it. It never came to fruition, not until much, much later. But the 1970 and the 1971 cars, they had a 4-speed tranny. I believe it was a quick ratio 4-speed tranny. Posi rear with 336-to-1 gears, forged aluminum coated pistons. In a slight difference from the earlier cars, the internals of the engine really wasn't as messed with as he did with the Camaros and as he did with the Novas and even the Chevelle. Really, there wasn't much done to the internals of the car. Still received, obviously, the Yenko striping, the emblems. He had a custom front splitter that I believe was made to mimic the Z28s at the time to kind of give them their own little style. But really, he didn't do a whole bunch with these cars. These cars were obviously not remembered, and they weren't the same as what the Yenko Camaro was.
And I think the biggest shame is that in both 71 and 72, they're about 200 produced. I think are the numbers.
400 total.
Which
200
is the most
each year.
Of any.
Most of any,
version.
and still fell short of his 500 turbocharged Vegas. I believe for them to do the Copo order, I think he had to produce at least 500, and I think that was the goal, and it just never came to fruition.
Do these cars come up for sale now? Like, can I go buy one at a otherwise decent rate, or?
I'm sure you could find one, at Mecum or something like that, but these cars, they still bear the Yenko name, they still bear that lineage, so they're still going to be an expensive car, and I know that some are out there. From what I can tell, though, there's only about 11 that remain that are registered. Now, that number obviously could go either way. I think it's probably more than that, but there really aren't a ton of these 400 cars that he had ordered and built. Maybe people just didn't see the value in it at the time, but
Sure.
There's not a lot left.
Well, I mean, especially by Vegas standards, they command a good dollar. So then he takes another stab at the turbo game roughly a decade later.
Yeah, so the EPA admissions, really did a number on him modifying cars, but in 81, he came back with based off the Camaro Z28, the Turbo Yenko, otherwise known as the Turbo Z. This turbo wasn't like turbos on the market. Typically, it was actually a blow-through turbo, so what it would do was push compressed air through the stock carburetor, had no wastegate, and it only maxed out at 7 psi. But other than that, it was an 8.2 to 1 compression, 2-bolt main, LM1 350. It was essentially a stock engine other than that blow-through turbo. Came in a 3-speed automatic, had a posi rear. It did, though, have that same Z28 F41 suspension that we mentioned earlier, and 15x7 painted steel wheels. I believe they also had the Yenko center caps as well. Did a few minor things to the interior. He deleted the factory radio, but then offered an aftermarket radio in case you wanted to put it back in. And then took the cigarette lighter out and put a boost gauge and a water level warning system. The car, though, there's no actual figures on what it was putting out horsepower-wise, but according to Hot Rod Magazine Performance Test, they ran a 1451 quarter mile at 97.81 miles an hour. And
Which we really laugh at by
today's standards
today,
yeah.
But
in the 80s,
a mid 14, and especially in the early 80s, before the Grand Nationals and Fox bodies, and cars that were able to put down an impressive number by today's standard, it's pretty good.
Yeah, and Hot Rod estimated about 240 to 250 horsepower. All in all, not a bad car. And this one also came in 2 different stages. Yenko was very much a guy who liked to offer choices to his customers.
Again, with the marketing and branding, slightly higher price for not too much different on what your cost is.
Yep. The Stage 1 car had air conditioning, cruise control, tilt steering wheel, special Turbo Z graphics that, if you remember the graphics from the 80s, no graphics were really all that good. And a front air dam that he modeled off the IROC car to give it a little bit of special, Yenko style. And then the Stage 2 came with Coney shocks. It had Gulfstrand polyurethane bushings, a special weld 2-piece 15x7 inch wheel with Goodyear Wingfoot radials. Came with leather seats and like a race mark steering wheel. So he made, a few different changes to it. But again, just like the Vega, not really a car where he messed with the engine all that much in comparison to the earlier cars. And of these cars, 19 were made, and only 3 of them were actually Stage 2 cars. So the other 16 were all Stage 1 cars. But in the time between 72 and 81, with 81 being the last true Yenko, Don still had offered a parts catalog, which basically get you performance upgrades, get you cosmetic upgrades. So you could still order some of these parts. So there are still, maybe you could call them Yenko cars out there that were, built from a parts catalog of Yenko. But there really aren't too many Yenko cars that were ever made, which makes them so rare when you actually see one come up for auction or, go up for sale.
Yeah, especially in 1981, this cost was an additional $10,000 for the 81 Yenko. So it's no surprise that he sold less than 20. Probably didn't have the name that he had in 68, 69, 70, where people from the West Coast and from the Southeast were ordering cars specifically from him. Looking forward now, unless there's other things you want to cover, what I am most impressed by is his impact on today's culture.
Yeah, so just to go back, in 81, that was the last year that the Yenko supercars, and actually Don sold the Yenko dealerships in 1982, put the end really on the Yenko modified Copo car, and at the age of 59, he was still an avid pilot, still flew a ton. Don actually passed away in a crash while landing his Cessna with 3 other people on March 5th in 1987. Outside of West Virginia, he'd come down for a landing, bounced a little bit, lost control, and went down over a bank, and that effectively put the end on one man's great legacy to motorsports.
Definitely, a sad end to an otherwise legacy. It's a shame, and who were to know what would have come? Him selling the dealership, probably not much, but you never know. So, if I ask you, when I say, Yenko Chevrolet, what do you immediately think of?
Well, I think of Yenko Deuce. I think Lou and I are both fortunate enough that we're PA boys, and, here's a legend that really was only, a couple-hour drive from here. So Yenko, at least in my family, we're Chevy guys, has always been a name that, was revered. He was a guy that we always, if you saw a true Yenko car ever, that was kind of like that thing on your bucket list, because they just don't exist. And, it being so close to home was a thing we took, almost an amount of pride in, being Chevy guys and being from Pennsylvania. So I always had a lot of respect for Don Yenko.
Sure. I mean, kind of embarrassed to say it, but the first time I ever saw a Yenko car was Too Fast, Too Furious. Cheesy movie for sure, but definitely paid, attention to this bright blue Camaro that's just totally not accurate at all by the way it jumps off a platform onto a yacht. But you go home and you research what that is, and then learning more about his race heritage and bending the rules in a way to produce a legitimate supercar, not just a typical production car, and selling them. Pretty impressive, and impressive enough where GM now owns the Yenko license. You or I could buy from a couple companies that will make us a brand new 67, 68, 69 Camaro. Yeah, so the continuation cars, and what's nice is that there is still a continuing legacy of Don Yenko. The trademark was bought by a company called General Marketing Capital Incorporated. They essentially, there's 2 ways you can go about this. You can either buy a 67, 68, 69 Camaro, Yenko, officially licensed Yenko car, or you can buy a new Camaro that is officially licensed for a Yenko car. But going back to the 67, 68s, and 69s, so if, let's say you missed out on one of those 11 cars that are left out there in the world and you really want one, there are a couple companies, a few of them are based in Tulsa, I believe, Oklahoma. One of them by the name of David Miller's brand new muscle car. And what they do is they will build either from brand new sheet metal, I believe they use Dynacorn, or they'll take the shell of your car and build you a Yenko Camaro. These cars start at about $150,000, so if you were hoping to get in one for a cheap price, it's not going to happen. And a lot of them easily eclipse the $200,000 mark with, add-ons as modern steering, modern suspension, things like that. But these are licensed by General Marketing Capital Incorporated, so
yeah. So these are official. Like they own the copyright to the Yenko name. So these are Yenko cars, Yenko continuation cars, and one of the things I read was that David Millard said that they started their cars. He put the number at 199 Yenko Camaros produced. They started their cars at 001 and not at 200. And they did that to realize that this is a continuation car. They're not building the same thing. They are building a separate car.
Sure.
So, these cars, they try to stick true to the original vision of Yenko. And I don't know that it was his vision. It was more imposed by Chevy. But they have a limit of a 427 cubic inch engine. You got a few options to get to that, though. You can go with the original L72 427 big block, estimated anywhere from 425 to 450 horsepower. You can build up a small block up to a 427, or you can get the modern LS7 engine, which is realistically the 427 equivalent today. You can also order these cars with the original transmission options, or you can upgrade to essentially any GM transmission. They'll give you a 4-speed, 5-speed, 6-speed manual, up to 10-speed automatics, pretty much whatever you want. They'll modernize the suspension on them by giving them a 4-link with coilovers, and that's all built by Chris Austin's Chassis Works. The wheels will come in a 15 or 17-inch standard size, which would have been standard for when Don was building the cars, but you can also get them in an 18-inch rim if you want a little better handling. And they offer Willwood disc brake upgrades over the standard 4-way drums, although you can still order that car if you want with manual 4-way drums. I'm not sure why you would want that, but you can. These cars also come with all the creature comforts that you would expect out of a modern car. So they have air conditioning, power windows, power wheels. But what they did, which I think is a great tribute, is they hid a lot of these things in the car. So the car inside still looks like a 67, 68, or 69 Camaro. And while they're staying true to Don, you can buy one of these cars with up to 1,000 horsepower. So they really come off the lot screaming. Now, you're not going to get the 5-year, 50,000-mile warranty with this car, but, hey. And I believe, if I remember correctly, you got to be careful with driving one of these in the street in California. I think they have some restrictions on that.
Well, with that being said, if you think $200,000 or $150,000 is a hefty price tag, correct original numbers matching commonly go for $220.
Oh yeah.
So this is essentially a brand new car that would fool the everyday consumer or even fan of the muscle car era. Then when you look at it more in depth too, with GM owning the Yenko license, they have teased bringing it back at Las Vegas's popular SEMA show. So 2009 was so that would be the fall of 2009. They did in fact roll out a 600 horsepower phase 1 Yenko Camaro that would have been a prototype for the 2010 model year. Although it never came to fruition, they did have plans for phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And then with the reintroduction of the Copo Camaro to, in my opinion, compete with the Hellcat, and then later Demon specific track car on the quarter mile, so a little bit different than what Yenko envisioned. But the 2009 Camaro marks the 50th year for the Copo program, so in special order performance, meaning that, hey, Camaro itself and Chevrolet themselves installed the engines for Yenko. So they do have a Copo Camaro 50th anniversary special edition package that marks the half-century mark, and you can buy a really, really impressive quarter-mile screamer that will compete with anything that Chrysler offers, Ford. Pretty interesting car. I think they've only plan on making 69, which is pretty cool in its own right.
Yeah, I think that was a little bit of a nod to Yenko. I can't remember which year they were honoring, but they were honoring one of the years with the production amounts.
With that being said, right, you could go two ways in what today's world is. You can go for the Copo Camaro or the e-Copo Camaro, fully electric quarter-mile screamer. I'm personally going to pick the LS. That sounds like a race car. Sam, in closing, we've talked a lot about Don and his legacy, but certainly what it means to us. I think what it's done for the car culture in itself. Speaking to the Carroll Shelbys and the Don Yenkos and Baldwin Motion, Nicky Chevrolet, it's just really given us all a platform to improve on, and they were able to leverage and utilize resources from the factory itself. But that's what hot rodding's about, right? So
Yeah, I think Don was one of those guys that really, tested the limits of what cars could be and what the perception of these cars could be. He famously was trying to do this to beat Ford. And, that goes back to that deep-rooted rivalry between brands. And, the fact that you can still buy one nowadays, like the 2019, I think they were producing 50 of them by a company called SVE, Specialty Vehicle Engineering, I believe is what it's called. But you can buy a Stage 2 Yenko Camaro 2019 based off the Camaro SS, so every modern thing you'd ever want, that puts out 1,000 horsepower from the factory.
It's just crazy.
It's insane to me. And I think you're right. It is in direct competition with the Dodge, Hellcat and the Demon and all that. But, it's just crazy to think that a guy from a small town south of Pittsburgh could do all this and leave such a mark on the racing and motorsports world.
Yeah, I mean, definitely a different version of the American dream, but certainly one that we can appreciate, and we thank him and his legacy for what they've given us today. So, as always, feedback's very important to Darren and the rest of the Cars of Carlisle network. So, certainly interested to hear what you guys have to say. Topics you'd like to cover. We're going to hopefully make this more of a network going forward rather than just one specific podcast. So let us know what you think, positive, negative. We're open to everything. We're learning here as we kind of do it. So appreciate the time you have given us this week, and looking forward to speaking with you again.
Yeah, and let us know if we got something wrong on the Yenko story. I mean, part of learning about these old pieces of car culture is combing through old things and trying to find what's real. So, like I said, there's a lot of variation in numbers, in amount of races Don had. So, if you have any information, we'd definitely love to hear it.
For sure. Well, Cubers, we thank you, and looking forward to hearing from you guys soon.
All right, we'll see you guys.
And we're back to the Corvette Z06 cockpit. Hope you enjoyed that with Sam and Lou. The Intracast that we're going to be having from them every 5 to 6 weeks is always going to just be so informative and really delve into a particular vehicle or era or someone that's been very influential in our automotive hobby. So thanks to Sam and Lou for all the work they put into the network with that. Guys, I owe you an answer for episode 63 and our trivia question. And in that trivia question, I asked you, what does the SYC on a Yenko vehicle stand for? And the answer is Yenko Supercars. The Y was essentially just like in a monogram you would see. It stood up prominently in the center, and the SC flanking on either side. So Yenko Supercars is your answer. And normally the SYC was either on the headrest of the vehicle or on the hood of the car itself. So now in the future, if you're at a car show or Cars and Coffee and you happen to see a gorgeous Yenko, you will know what that SYC is all about. And that's episode 63 trivia answer. Regardless if you're in New England or the UK or Brazil or Sweden or Germany or Arizona or California, it all means the same. Drive well, be well, take care.